2002 was a great year. It saw the release of the masterpiece that is Monsters, Inc. Scare Island, a 3D level-based platformer for the PS1 system, which followed Mike and Sully through a training regimen on the titular island. The game featured several unique biomes that could be played in any order, each filled with precise platforming challenges, a hub area that could be used to travel between them, and a boss-type challenge at the end of each biome. It also provided new abilities that would enable you to backtrack through previous levels and find collectibles in areas that had previously been inaccessible. I don't think anyone, then or now, would argue that Scare Island is a Metroidvania. I bring this up because Imp of the Sun is exactly this type of game. It is a level-based platformer with biomes that can be played in any order, it has a hub area that is used to travel between them, and a boss challenge at the end of each one, and it provides new abilities that let you backtrack through previous levels to find collectibles in areas that had previously been inaccessible. Yes, this last point is a feature of Metroidvanias, but it is by no means exclusive. Rise of the Tomb Raider and Control let you do this as well, and I wouldn't consider them Metroidvanias either. What sets the genre apart is not simply backtracking with new abilities, but a ground-up approach to design that incorporates non-linear exploration and ability-driven progression, and Imp of the Sun just doesn't have that. On a fundamental level, its design shares more in common with platformers of the PS1 era like Tarzan or Hercules than it does with modern Metroidvanias like Ori and the Blind Forest. And you know what? That's fine. Not every game needs to be Ori, and traditional platformers are awesome. Some of my favorite games of all time are actually from this era. So why do I bring this up at all? Why does it matter? Because when doing a game review or critique, especially a critique, I believe it is important to take the game in question on its own terms, judging based on what the game is trying to be and how well it achieves that vision, not on what you want it to be based on personal preference or on other games you've played. I've seen a number of people calling Imp of the Sun a Metroidvania and comparing it to games like Ori and the Blind Forest, and while there are definitely some surface level similarities there, I think this is doing a disservice to the game in the long run. Such comparisons are inherently unfavorable because, fundamentally, Imp of the Sun isn't like those games. It's also worth noting that, as far as I can tell, the developers haven't claimed it to be one. The official description tags it as an action platformer and does not mention the word Metroidvania anywhere. So, as an action platformer, what is the experience Imp of the Sun promises players? The keywords here are streamlined gameplay, fluid movement, and combo-based combat. While most Metroidvanias use their platforming as a means to an end, whether that be experiencing a great story or becoming immersed in an exotic new world, I think it's safe to say that Imp of the Sun incorporates platforming as the core experience in and of itself. Story and exploration are elements of the game as well, but they are supplemental rather than in the forefront. With all that preamble out of the way, let's get into it. As indicated by the name, any level-based platformer needs to have two essential qualities to really shine: good level design and good platforming. Imp of the Sun is unfortunately a mixed bag in both of these areas. Let's go over level design first. The game has 4 unique levels: mountain, jungle, desert, and underworld, as well as a 5th valley area that functions as the tutorial and world hub. Taken individually, these levels are striking with beautiful artwork, music, and distinct atmospheres. The Peruvian aesthetic is very effective, and each area is designed with a strong sense of identity. The mountain is predictably about verticality and ascent, with crumbling rocks and enemies that try to knock you into the open air. The jungle is cramped and dark, choked with an abundance of life and filled with hazardous water. The desert is all about space, with wide chasms to be crossed and a massive temple to be explored. And the underworld focuses on stifling darkness, using twisting maze-like puzzles to confuse the player as their light supply dwindles. To overcome these challenges, the player is given a single core ability at the beginning of each level that is essential for completing it. I'll come back to those later though. The levels themselves are mostly filled with basic puzzles that involve finding levers, keys, and statue eyes to unlock the way forward. Nothing groundbreaking here, very traditional stuff, but for the most part it's done well and forward progress is always satisfying. While this all seems great on the surface, and to an extent it is, there is one massive problem that sadly undermines every single one of these levels. They are functionally independent of each other and can be played in any order. That may sound like a pro and not a con, but the issue becomes apparent very quickly as you play the game. Every area had to be designed to be playable as the very first area when the player only has the one ability obtained in that area. As a result, the second, third, and fourth areas get dramatically easier since you can now cheat the level's original design, which gives the game an oddly inverted difficulty scale. The worst offender is the air dash ability obtained in the desert, which is the area that the game oddly encourages you to do first. The ability itself is fantastic, but it completely nullifies the design of the other three areas. You can effortlessly skip over platforms, obstacles, and enemies that had been designed for a player without the dash, and instead of feeling empowering, it just feels kinda wrong, like you're using a mod or cheating somehow. All of the abilities feel like this to some degree, with each one invalidating parts of the other three areas. The boss fights suffer as well, with each one getting dramatically easier since you have more tools than necessary to fight them. The developers did seem to be aware of this inverted difficulty and tried to remedy it by scaling enemy health in each consecutive area, but this really does nothing to increase difficulty and only ends up increasing the amount of time you spend smacking baddies around. At the very end of the game, once you've beaten the 4 bosses, you are given access to the underground paths, which contain 4 unique challenges that test your skills with all the abilities. These are easily some of the best designed sequences of the game, and I can't help but think that the developers really shot themselves in the foot by committing to the non-linear layout of the levels. If they had locked in a specific order, they could have tailored every area to your current abilities and made the game more challenging with a standard difficulty scale. On the subject of difficulty, let's move on and talk about the game's platforming. Any game with substantial platforming as part of its core design needs 2 fundamental elements to be satisfying: precision and flow, and unfortunately Imp of the Sun struggles significantly in both of these areas. Starting with precision. The hardest boss you will face in this game is Inertia. Nin is fast but floaty and heavy, which means it takes a moment to reach top speed and even longer to slow down, especially in the air, which makes even simple platforming sequences deceptively difficult. I'm not kidding when I say that these simple physics will probably kill you more times than all the bosses combined. This is really unfortunate because it means that the platforming is never totally satisfying. You adapt to the controls eventually, of course, but the feeling that you're fighting with them to do what you want never quite goes away. I have to wonder if this was intentional. Did the developers code Nin's physics this way to add artificial difficulty? Were they simply unable to get it working better? Or did they actually feel like these were the optimal controls for the game? That's basically all I have to say on the topic. Now for flow. Flow is a bit more difficult to pin down than precision, but I would define it as how smoothly the game transitions from sequence to sequence, typically, but not exclusively, a platforming one. To its credit, Imp of the Sun has excellent flow as it relates to the level design, and once you memorize the layout of each level, you can fly right through them. The game has no map, which might come as a surprise to those expecting a Metroidvania experience, but it honestly has no need of one. The world is really quite small and can be easily memorized in a single playthrough. Additionally, there are shortcuts built into and between each of the areas that can streamline a run if you know where to go. This is all great for the game's sense of flow, but I want to draw attention to a couple of issues that bog it down. First is the camera, which is fixed but has a dynamic zoom feature built in. It will zoom in very close and out very far based on your location, and while this is occasionally effective at establishing the scale of a set piece or conveying a cramped tunnel, it is far more often a hindrance. The Imp is very fast, and barreling down a narrow passage is quite dangerous when you can't see what's right in front of you. At other times, the camera will zoom out so far that it is difficult to see enemy attack animations. A related issue is that the camera is inconsistent as well and can become stuck in the wrong location or zoom amount, which can result in enemies hitting you from off-screen, having a hard time reaching objects off-screen, or falling off the face of the earth, off-screen. The second major barrier to flow is bugs. All games have bugs, of course, but Imp of the Sun has significantly more than most relative to its small size. What follows is a list of the most egregious bugs that I found. While none of these bugs were game-breaking per se, and the game has generous save points that minimize the penalty for restarting the software, they do significantly interrupt the flow of the experience. After the triple crash fiasco in the jungle, I was kind of on edge the rest of the area, expecting it to happen again, which pulled me out of the experience. After level design and platforming, the next most important pillar in Imp of the Sun is combat. And while it's clear a lot of effort was put into this system, it unfortunately ends up feeling rather hollow. Most enemy types are very basic and only capable of one type of attack, but they make up for this by having extremely quick attack animations that can be difficult to avoid, and also spawning right on top of you. Some enemies are more interesting and require a little bit of strategy, such as knocking back their projectiles or dashing through them to open a window of vulnerability, but there's always the option to stay back and pelt them with your spear instead. In addition to enemies being scattered throughout each of the levels, there are also one-time combat zones that will lock you into the area and prevent you from leaving until you defeat all the enemies. While not my favorite design for combat encounters, I do have to say they work pretty well here. The Imp is given several basic combat abilities: ground attacks, air attacks, and aforementioned spears which deplete your inner fire. The basic attacks have considerable knockback, and you are encouraged to combo enemies into the air, which is definitely the most enjoyable aspect of combat. An airborne enemy is also a harmless enemy, so there's a level of skill expression here as well. Now, this one is admittedly a nitpick, but one other issue I have with the combat is the sound played when an enemy is hit. It just sounds like a cartoony rubber smack, and while these characters are cartoony, it always felt off to me and not very satisfying. That brings us to the bosses, which are, perhaps unsurprisingly, also a mixed bag. Seeing a pattern here? I thought the keepers were fantastic in terms of presentation and overall design, very well done in that regard, but unfortunately the encounters themselves fall quite short. As mentioned earlier, each boss gets progressively easier and can all be easily defeated the first try, except maybe for Tui. Urku, Ruku, and Tui have easily exploitable patterns, and those first two have large windows of time for healing as well, which considerably lowers the risk of failure. I personally found Lanthu to be the most interesting boss conceptually. I've always preferred indirect boss fights that require some puzzle solving as opposed to just big health sponges, and the whole jump scare from the shadows concept was very effective, but the encounter ultimately falls flat because the only difficulty is figuring out exactly what you're supposed to do, not in the execution itself. Which is getting all 4 torches lit at the same time, but there aren't any clear indications that this is the goal since the chamber stays the same level of darkness until the 4th torch is lit. A simple clarity fix would have been slightly increasing the chamber's ambient light with every torch lit so the player can see the effect from each one. There is also a safe zone where you can repeatedly heal, so the risk of failure here is slim to none. For better or worse, I actually thought that the mini-bosses were more challenging and fared better from a gameplay perspective than the keepers. These bosses must be defeated to gain each of the 4 core abilities, and while they were only amped up versions of standard enemies, I found them to be fairly interesting to fight, especially the genie encountered in the jungle. In addition to being faster paced, one thing these fights do well is limit your ability to heal, meaning that you must learn the boss's patterns and dodge effectively in order to beat them. Given the letdown of the keepers, I was a little worried how the game's final boss would turn out, so I was pleasantly surprised to find the Imp of the Moon quite well designed. And the reason is actually pretty obvious. It could be designed with all 4 of the Imp's abilities in mind. Just like the underground paths, this enabled it to have far more variety and difficulty, and this paired with the constant resource management mechanic made for a very dynamic encounter. You have to choose how to use your slowly regenerating fire. Do you activate Blaze for heavy damage, or save it for healing, or save it for smoke form so as to dodge its unavoidable attacks? It would appear the developers know how to design a decent fight, so it's really a shame that they handicapped themselves with the keepers by making them all viable as the first boss. Speaking of abilities, let's cover those next. I was originally planning to lump them into the earlier section on platforming, but there's so much to go over here that I wanted to give them their own section. The only ability you start the game with, besides sliding and jumping, is regeneration, which allows you to use inner fire to recharge your health. It's a simple enough mechanic, but Imp of the Sun's twist on it is that your fire will only regenerate on the surface where there's ambient sunlight, or when in the vicinity of a lit torch. This means that healing is very easy in some areas and more difficult in others, though there are so many torches that it very rarely becomes a challenge. The more interesting part of this mechanic is that it also functions as the fuel for your other abilities, which means you have to balance its offensive and defensive capabilities based on the situation. Now for the 4 core abilities. Simply put, I think they're exceptional. The wall jump is the most basic of the 4 and lets you, jump on walls. It just works, I don't know what else you could ask for. The air dash is very satisfying, and the ability to dash up and down as well as diagonally pleasantly sets it apart from similar dashes in other games. The blaze ability is very effective and is able to perform multiple functions. It lights up everything on screen, including sections out of your line of sight. It lights torches, increases combat strength, and allows you to destroy blaze boxes which open new paths. The 4th ability, Smoke Form, is the one I found to be the most interesting. Like Blaze, it performs many functions. It increases the height of your jump, including wall jumps and air dashes. It lets you pass through porous barriers, makes you invulnerable to enemies and their attacks, and lets you walk on fragile surfaces without breaking them. That is a lot of functionality built into one ability, and it takes quite a lot of practice to use effectively. I found it especially interesting to have the dodge ability not tied to your dash as it is in so many other games, because it meant each could be used independently. Unfortunately, the insane potential of Smoke Form is somewhat wasted since the game never gets difficult enough to challenge your ability with its multiple functions. In addition to the 4 core abilities, there are 4 extra abilities obtained throughout the game, one from each of the 4 keepers. Tui's Slash does heavy damage while knocking enemies away, Ruku's Health Regen lets you regenerate 3 hearts, Urku's Fireball does heavy damage in a target direction, and Lanthu's Roar freezes all nearby enemies for a short time. All of these abilities are interesting and can be used to great effect in the right situations, but you only rarely get to use them because they are gated behind dealing a certain amount of damage in combat, and most combat encounters just don't last long enough to charge them more than once, if at all. I think a good trade-off would have been to weaken the abilities considerably but make them more accessible, so the player could weave them into their attack combos more regularly. Next, I want to touch on the story, though this section will be pretty short. Imp of the Sun is candid in establishing from the start that the story is not a priority. It provides a basic exposition and then sends you on your way, never getting much deeper, which is totally fine. Not every game needs a deep story. And it actually works very well in this case, since the story is built on a rich bed of Peruvian folklore that lends a lot of weight to the simple tale. I really enjoyed learning about Peruvian mythology, and the fable-like tale of the moon tricking the keepers into weakening the sun was profound even in its simplicity. The twist at the end, in which you learn there is an Imp of the Moon, was well done, and even sets the game up well for a sequel should that be the developer's intent. The story is told primarily through the Kipu scrolls scattered throughout the levels, and minor details can be gleaned from conversation with Kari as well as the keepers. Something worth mentioning here is that Imp of the Sun has full voice acting for all of these characters, in Peruvian with subtitles, and I can't overstate how much that elevates these story beats. Far too many indie games skimp out on voice acting in my opinion, choosing instead to communicate through text boxes alone, and while this works fine for some games, it just can't match the value of real dialogue like we see here. One thing I would have liked to see in the story is some kind of dynamic element involving Suyana. She's a cute character, but mostly just acts as the game's hint guide thanks to her definitely not magic walkie-talkie provided by her certainly not time-traveling inventor Grandpa. I really wanted to see her get involved in the story, and I was absolutely certain it would happen in this scene with the Imp of the Moon kidnapping her to sidetrack you, but then it just didn't happen. The game never really sets an expectation for dynamic elements like this, but I still think a little could have gone a long way. Now for the secret endings. If you find all the collectibles before fighting the Imp of the Moon, you'll get a bonus cutscene after the credits that shows both of the imps are still alive well after the events of the game. Furthermore, if you find all 4 secret keys scattered throughout the levels, which are very cleverly hidden I might add, and use them to open the passage below the underground paths, you'll meet a mysterious character who gives you the bonus Kipu, which reveals the existence of an Imp of the Earth as well. While not the most shocking of reveals, it's still an interesting detail that expands the lore of the game just a little bit more, not to mention providing more material for a potential sequel. Finally, I want to talk about Imp of the Sun's new game plus mode, aptly named Eclipse Mode Plus. I'm usually not all that interested in these types of modes, but this one caught my eye since it was described as being the authentic experience that significantly alters the game in various ways. The main differences are that you get all of your abilities from the start, you keep your collectibles progress, some puzzles are adjusted to be more difficult and or require the use of multiple abilities, enemies are more numerous and strong, and, as the name implies, the land has no ambient sunlight, which means lighting torches is your only means of regenerating inner fire. It's honestly a great mode, definitely an improvement over the default mode, and even alleviated or outright fixed some issues that I've already discussed. Most notable is that each of the levels was reworked a bit to require the use of all 4 of your abilities, which mostly takes the form of platforms having been removed and new obstacles being added, including the purple spikes, which are never seen in the default mode. Many of the new puzzles feel like real platforming challenges and elevate the gameplay experience significantly. Other changes include combat lasting longer, which means it is much easier to charge up the keeper abilities and use them multiple times in a fight, and the keeper bosses themselves are made more challenging. Well, in theory at least. Since you have access to blaze for every fight, and every boss encounter has torches, it's pretty easy to face tank the boss's damage with blaze permanently up, and just use 2E's regeneration to heal as needed. With this strategy, the bosses were even easier the second time than they were on the first go, and I took down the Imp of the Moon so quickly it never even had time to trigger the platforming sequence. Lanthu fared slightly better since there's the torch lighting element along with the fighting, and the developers wisely removed the safe platforms to make healing more of a risk, but he was honestly still a bit of a pushover. All things considered, Eclipse mode is the superior mode, and I can't help but wonder why it isn't the game's default mode to begin with. If the whole premise of the game is that the sun is completely blocked and you're the only imp who can restore its light, it doesn't really make sense for the land to be bathed in sunlight as it is in the default mode. It makes me wonder if the developers intended the game to be accessible for children as well as adults, which is totally fine, though the inverted difficulty would likely prove to be a major obstacle for younger players. Now, if Eclipse mode had been the default mode, I think it would have been interesting for the New Game Plus to go a step further and shroud every area in darkness as thick as the Underworld area, which would require you to use blaze to light your path forward in the desert, mountain, and jungle. This would significantly alter the approach needed for each area and make managing your inner fire much more difficult, not to mention it would help sell the Eclipse's severity thematically. To wrap things up, I want to make it clear that I think Imp of the Sun is a good game, especially for players looking for a traditional platforming experience. It's flawed, and I've focused on those flaws maybe more than was necessary, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy my time with the game and wasn't hoping for a sequel. The reason I wanted to discuss this title in depth is because I feel there's a lot to like here and a lot that does work well, but I think its superficial similarities to the Metroidvania genre have led to some unrealistic expectations for it. If you're a fan of traditional platformers and have your expectations set accordingly, chances are you'll have a great time with Imp of the Sun. Thank you so much for watching to the end of the video, and please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you'd like to see more game critiques like this in the future. I'll see you next time.